The Soviet Navy vessel is classified as top secret and has a wingspan that makes it seem more at ease below the water than above it. The Caspian Sea Monster, a 350-ton Lun-class ship that can reach speeds of up to 550 kilometers per hour, is named after the Russian term for the harrier, a bird of prey. The ship is categorized as a ship by the International Maritime Organization. Only a single ship, however, ever set sail. It wasn't a novel concept to use ground effect as a mode of transportation. While German engineers dabbled with the idea throughout World War II, it wasn't until Soviet designer Rostislav Evgenyevich Alexeyev, famous for his groundbreaking work on the hydrofoil, developed the ekranoplan that it became a reality. Using what is known as the ground effect, a cushion of high pressure that forms under the wings of extremely low-flying aircraft, the ekranoplan flew barely 1 to 5 meters over the waves. By drawing in less air resistance, the ship is able to go faster and use less fuel. The Soviet Union may have gained an advantage in Cold War naval combat with the help of the ekranoplan, a military vehicle that was both fast and stealthy. As the number of U.S. carrier groups increased, the ekranoplan was an asymmetrical reaction. In order to neutralize the stronger Western troops, Soviet military doctrine stressed the need of swift and surprising strikes. It has 6 nuclear missiles along its spine and could elude aircraft radar and ship torpedoes. An aircraft carrier may have been destroyed with only 1 missile. In order to avoid conventional naval defenses and escape any potential reprisal, the ekranoplan might conduct missile attacks against American carriers. The ekranoplan may have changed the face of naval combat forever, thanks to its peak speed, which was 8 times faster than the fastest U.S. aircraft carrier. The Soviet Navy received its first ekranoplan in 1987. There were a number of serious problems with the ekranoplan, despite its potential. Even somewhat choppy waves prevented it from taking flight. It was also unable to reach greater heights. From the start, the ship was useless since it couldn't soar over rough waters and needed calm ones to function. A single craft was constructed prior to the program's termination. When the Soviet Union fell in 1991, a second ship, Spasatel, also known as Rescuer, was almost finished. As the Soviet Union drew to a close, its focus changed from military aggression to humanitarian relief. The Spasatel, in contrast to its predecessor, was planned as a field hospital that could be quickly sent to coastal regions. Sitting in Dagestan's Kaspiysk naval base for the next 3 decades was the lone completed ekranoplan of the Lun class. The Russian city of Derbent received it in July 2020 after it was hauled 100 kilometers. The ekranoplan was meant to serve as the centerpiece of Patriot Park, an upcoming museum and amusement park devoted to the military accomplishments of the Soviet Union. The ekranoplan became stranded on a beach as it was being towed. Because they were unable to liberate the ship, they put a permanent guard on watch. The ekranoplan started to absorb water into its hull as a result of being exposed to severe waves. To save the ekranoplan from more harm, a salvage effort transferred it to dry ground in December 2020. As a more eco-friendly substitute for conventional ships, new companies such as Regent Craft are developing ground effect vehicles. These eco-friendly freight and passenger vehicles hover just above the water, reducing drag and conserving energy. The demonstration began on the afternoon of May 21, 1946, at a secret laboratory in a canyon 3 miles from Los Alamos, New Mexico, the atom bomb's birthplace. Canadian scientist Louis Slotin was teaching his colleagues how to tickling the dragon's tail, bringing the exposed core of a nuclear weapon to criticality. The core, lying alone on a low table, was a dull metal hemisphere with a plutonium nub in the middle, warm to the touch due to radiation. After the bombing of Nagasaki, it was quickly shaped to attack Japan again, but it was later repurposed. Slotin was likely the world's leading plutonium handler at the time. He helped manufacture the first atomic bomb a year earlier, and a contemporaneous picture shows him calmly standing near its parts with his shirt undone and sunglasses on. Back then, bombs were handcrafted. The Slotin method was straightforward. He brought the tamper, a half shell of beryllium, over the core, halting just before it fit tightly. The tamper would deflect neutrons from the plutonium, creating a weak, short-lived nuclear chain reaction that the scientists could observe. Left-handed Slotin held the tamper. He had a long screwdriver in his right hand to wedge between the components and keep them apart. One of his co-workers, Raymer Schreiber, was distracted by unrelated work while he slowly lowered the tamper, anticipating the experiment to remain boring until many more seconds. He heard Slotin's screwdriver slip and the tamper fall over the core behind him. After turning around, Schreiber saw a burst of blue light and felt heat on his face. A guard guarding the plutonium in the room had little idea what Slotin was doing. After the core began glowing and people yelled, he raced out the door and up a neighboring hill. Subsequent estimations placed the total number of fission processes at roughly 3 quadrillion, 1,000,000 times smaller than the first atomic bombs, but still enough to throw off a considerable burst of radiation. Radioactivity energized air electrons, which generated high-energy photons, the blue flash, when they returned to their unexcited form. The lab was primarily evacuated by ambulance. While waiting for aid, the scientists calculated their radiation exposure. Slotin created a drawing of where everyone had been standing when the slide happened. He next attempted to use a radiation detector on several things that were near the core: a bristle brush, an empty Coca-Cola bottle, a hammer, a measuring tape. It was hard to acquire an accurate result since the detector was badly polluted. Slotin asked one of his colleagues to put radioactivity detecting film badges around the area, which forced the scientists to venture dangerously near to the still-hot core. A subsequent investigation noted that humans are in no condition for rational behavior after such an exposure, despite the mission yielding no valuable data. The protest witnesses were hospitalized at Los Alamos. Before being examined, Slotin vomited once, then numerous times in the following hours, but stopped by dawn. His health appeared fine, but his left hand, first numb and tingling, hurt worse. This was the hand closest to the core, and scientists calculated it got about 15,000 rem of low-energy X-rays. Slotin's whole body dose was around 2,100 rem of neutrons, gamma rays, and X-rays. 500 rem is usually fatal for humans. Blisters and waxy blue skin developed on the hand. Slotin's doctors iced it to reduce swelling and agony. His right hand, which held the screwdriver, exhibited milder sensations. Slotin phoned his parents, in Winnipeg, who were flown down to New Mexico on the Army's pay. They came 4 days after the catastrophe. On the 6th day, Slotin's white blood cell count decreased drastically. His pulse and temperature changed. From this day on, the patient failed rapidly, the study said. Slotin lost weight due to nausea and gastrointestinal discomfort. One doctor described his internal radiation burns, a 3-dimensional sunburn. On day 7, he had mental confusion. He was in an oxygen tent with bluish lips. He fell into a coma. 9 days after the tragedy, he died at 35. Radiation sickness, or acute radiation syndrome, was the cause. He was buried in Winnipeg in a sealed Army coffin. Slotin was one of only 2 persons to die from radiation exposure at Los Alamos, while the facility was under military administration. In those early years, from 1943 to 1946, there were around 24 more deaths: truck and tractor accidents, unintended weapons discharges, a suicide, a drowning, a fall from a horse. 4 deaths were due to bad luck, involving janitors who shared antifreeze-laced muscatel wine. Only Slotin and Harry Daghlian, Jr. died from Manhattan Project hazards. Daghlian performed a criticality experiment with the identical plutonium core 9 months before Slotin's disaster, using tungsten carbide blocks instead of the beryllium tamper. After dropping a block, the core temporarily turned critical. It took nearly a month to kill Daghlian. Los Alamos stopped criticality work after Slotin's failed demonstration. It was always dangerous. Enrico Fermi informed Slotin he would be dead within a year if he continued. But the Second World War prioritized expediency above safety. Handcrafted critical masses were easily adjusted. By the time Slotin died, speed was unnecessary. Despite its concerns, the Cold War may be handled more slowly. After the mishap, a document advised using remote controls and more liberal use of the inverse square law, the idea that a little distance reduces radiation exposure. After the accidents, Rufus, the plutonium pit that murdered Daghlian and Slotin, became the Demon Core. No such derogatory names were given to the Hiroshima and Nagasaki pits that killed tens of thousands. Such is the difference, perhaps, between intended and unintended harm, between the core carefully assembled for the purpose of mass destruction and the core reserved for the realm of experiment. An unassuming poplar tree in the Korean Demilitarized Zone, DMZ, in the summer of 1976, became the implausible spark that ignited one of the most intense military escalations between the US and North Korea. A potentially explosive incident almost sparked a new war on the Korean peninsula when what started as ordinary tree trimming escalated out of control. The tree blocked view at an important checkpoint, and a weird standoff known as Operation Paul Bunyan ensued shortly after. The Korean Demilitarized Zone, DMZ, was a small strip of territory that separated North and South Korea following the Korean War in 1953. In spite of its moniker, the Demilitarized Zone, DMZ, was among the world's most strongly fortified frontiers. It represented the enmity between the United States allied South Korea and Communist North Korea, which was supported by China and the Soviet Union during the Cold War. With troops from both sides posted meters apart, poised for battle at a moment's notice, the delicate truce was continually put to the test by militaristic rhetoric, skirmishes, and spying. Even a little event runs the danger of becoming a major conflict in an already volatile environment. The DMZ was the site of a tragic turn on August 18, 1976, during an apparently routine operation. US and South Korean soldiers were unable to see the Bridge of No Return, a vital strategic conduit between North and South Korea, because a big poplar tree had grown too close to Checkpoint 3, an important outpost in the Joint Security Area, JSA. A squad of American and South Korean troops, under the command of Captain Arthur Boniface and Lieutenant Mark Barrett, were sent to prune the tree in order to improve visibility. They started their work with only axes, not realizing the disaster that was about to befall them. Senior Lieutenant Pak Chol, leading a group of North Korean troops, violently insisted that the operation cease while they were working, citing the symbolic importance of the tree. Rapid escalation of tensions led to an unexpected and brutal assault by North Korean forces. On the scene, Captain Boniface was slain, and Lieutenant Barrett subsequently died to his wounds after suffering serious injuries. The murder of 2 American policemen stunned the globe and escalated a harmless tree-trimming mission into a catastrophic diplomatic crisis, threatening conflict between North Korea and the United States. Operation Paul Bunyan, the United States' display of overwhelming might in response to these atrocities, was both symbolic and ludicrous. Just 3 days after the tragic event on August 21, 1976, the United States initiated a complex military operation, not to target North Korea, but to remove the notorious poplar tree. With the help of tanks, fighter planes, assault helicopters, and B-52 bombers, hundreds of men returned to the scene, displaying an impressive show of might. An overwhelming force of more than 300 men was organized by the U.S. military. Cutting down the tree that had set off the disaster was the objective. As they stood silently by, the North Koreans allowed the tree to be chopped down. The goal of Operation Paul Bunyan was to avoid direct confrontation while sending a strong message of strength and deterrent. The massive operation, which required extensive military resources to cut down a single tree, brought attention to the strangeness of the stalemate and the fact that the 2 countries were on the verge of going to war over an insignificant matter. Even though the tree had fallen, the incident had a profound impact on the delicate truce between the 2 Koreas. Drugs, nukes, and animal operatives. The 1960s saw more than Operation MK Ultra, the CIA's human mind control operation. In that decade, the U.S. government used ravens, pigeons, and cats to spy on Cold War enemies, says Smithsonian Magazine's Tom Vanderbilt. Project Acoustic Kitty was never investigated by Congress, unlike MK Ultra, although CIA papers and sources prove its existence. Although cats are unruly, the CIA felt they might become spies with training. The group also planned to use the animal's curiosity. It believed that a cat linked to capture sound may go undetected and be manipulated to record intriguing noises like Soviet leader speaks using audio cues. The core tragic narrative of Acoustic Kitty appears many times. According to former CIA Associate Director Victor Marchetti, it entailed developing a Franken-kitty. Marchetti often says, "They slit the cat open, put batteries in him, wired him up. They made a monster." It seems plausible. After all, the 1960s CIA did weird things. Matt Soniak of Mental Floss explains that Project Acoustic Kitty's story is complicated. It actually took 5 years to complete, he writes. In the age of reel-to-reel audio and room-sized computers, making a high-tech cat was difficult. However, a cab killed the cat while crossing the road on the first trip. It never reached the goal. Acoustic Kitty and the project were cancelled in 1967. I'm not sure for how long after the operation the cat would have survived even if it hadn't been run over. NSA Archives' Jeffrey Richelson told The Telegraph. The extensively classified letter, Views on Trained Cats, in the National Security Administration Library at George Washington University, reveals the research wasn't a complete failure. The document states that the concept was not practicable for our very specific demands after examining trained cats for use in the program. The document said discovering that cats can indeed be trained to move short distances was, in itself, a remarkable scientific achievement. The record of any further acoustic kitties is unknown, although small computers and high-tech espionage devices may have prevented a revival. Once World War II ended, a new sort of warfare arose. After Nazi Germany fell, new alliances formed. The US, North Korea, and China fought a deadly stalemate on the Korean Peninsula in the early 1950s, when the Soviet Union created the atomic weapon using stolen American data. In the last days of World War II, East-West espionage focused on Berlin, the Allied prize. Both factions fought for control of the split city. In 1954, the CIA launched Operation Gold, a risky scheme to tap communication links from Western France to the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe. The Berlin Tunnel event, one of the most daring Cold War spy operations, started. Operation Gold began in Vienna in 1948. Vienna was a hub of espionage after the war, like Berlin. Vienna, like Berlin, had 4 military zones run by Britain, the US, France, and the USSR. One of their finest operatives, Peter Lunn, investigated Soviet communications in Vienna because the British wanted to learn more. Lunn discovered that Soviet military headquarters in Vienna was connected to Moscow via Austrian telephone connections. All Moscow communications to its military nerve center in Austria went via the Imperial Hotel, utilizing trunk lines in Schwechat. MI6 acquired a nearby building, paved it with reinforced concrete, and constructed a 70-foot tunnel from the basement to the wires. Operation Silver was the plan. MI6 created a Harris Tweed import firm to hide its true aim from the Soviets. MI6 was pleased when the firm grew, enabling the spies to operate covertly. Eventually, the British and CIA communicated their results and worked together to share the intelligence bounty. The phone taps gave MI6 the Soviet Union's order of battle strategy and high-level military preparations from Moscow. The 1948-1952 Operation Silver success inspired the CIA's Berlin Tunnel project a few years later. After Berlin was partitioned after World War II, the U.S. established its military headquarters there in July 1945. In Zehlendorf, Berlin, the American portion bordered the British zone. The CIA, under the cover name Bob, Berlin Operating Base, commenced activities from a large home there. Soviet intelligence efforts focused on Berlin. Russia ruled their region with an iron grip, targeting the US and conducting a massive espionage operation in the city, including informers, double agents, and other suspects. The Secret Intelligence Section and X-2 Counterintelligence were two key CIA departments at BOB. These two units may defeat the Soviets in Berlin. As BOB activities grew, they went beyond military intelligence. BOB agents focused on the city's enormous Soviet-controlled sector's economy. Infiltrators and other covert assets helped BOB break into the Soviet intelligence headquarters in Berlin, Karlshorst. Tracking the late 1940s Russian atomic weapon development was one of BOB's greatest achievements. It informed Washington that the Soviets were extracting uranium ore, a bomb component. The U.S. Army provided logistical and transportation support for BOB operations in Berlin. BOB reported to Theater G2, Intelligence, under General Edwin Seibert. BOB became Europe's greatest intelligence outfit and kept Washington informed throughout the 1948 Berlin blockade. BOB was well positioned to provide essential knowledge when Operation Gold was planned. Based on the Vienna operation's success, the CIA's senior brass studied how to replicate the British achievement in Berlin, beneath the Russians and their East German partners' noses. The greatest CIA scientists concluded that attacking the subterranean cables underneath the city was the most apparent solution after an intensive analysis. CIA experts realized that above-ground listening sites could not monitor wires. However, underground taps were unlikely to be identified. In 1953, a CIA double agent tapped the East Berlin telephone exchange and patched local phone lines to West Berlin while no one was watching to verify this claim. The tap was so effective, it was never found, that the CIA began Operation Gold. The strategy was scientifically tested in 1953, with every possibility played out. The completed concept was forwarded to CIA Director Allen Dulles for approval after study. Dulles, a WLSU OSS spy master, spotted a promising idea and chose to pursue it. The greatest CIA clandestine operation of the Cold War began with his approval. BOB agents decided to start excavating in Berlin's Altglienicke area after due consideration. For cover, the CIA started building an Air Force radar installation and storage in February 1954. The Soviets monitored the CIA's Berlin operations, but they didn't notice when the Americans started erecting the building. They believed it was another military post. CIA briefed British about Operation Gold. Bad idea in hindsight. The briefing included Soviet mole George Blake, a British intelligence officer. Blake made detailed notes and informed his case officer, Sergei Kondrashev, shortly after the encounter. Soviets had a choice. The CIA appointed William King Harvey, a swashbuckling James Bond-like operative who often carried a pistol, to lead Operation Gold. Harvey quit the FBI for the CIA following a fight with Director J. Edgar Hoover. Harvey was known for drinking a lot of alcohol before lunch and was cautious of anyone who didn't live hard. He joined Staff C, the CIA's counterintelligence branch, since he liked the new agency. One of his early tasks was to expose Kim Philby, the British Intelligence Service's chief Soviet mole in Washington, D.C. Harvey became Berlin's sensitive CIA station commander in 1952. Harvey surreptitiously recruited many East German double agents, notably communications specialists, as BOB operatives could not enter East Germany. When these spies went west, they brought critical East German government communications intelligence. Operator Gold's most significant double agent, an anonymous source designated Sniper, informed BOB of Soviet infiltration of Western interests in Berlin. Harvey told a few BOB personnel about Operation Gold, described as compartmented information in espionage terminology. He even hid the tunnel from BOB's 1954 second-in-command, Robert Murphy. Harvey updated Dulles on the tunnel functioning, and Dulles approved. After covert London discussions with British intelligence, tunnel construction started a year later. U.S. Army Corps of Engineers started excavating in Russian-occupied eastern Berlin. A vertical shaft connecting Soviet telephone wires was built by the British. Before building the Berlin Tunnel, the Corps of Engineers erected a replica in the New Mexico desert with the same dimensions. Harvey even deceived West Berlin's mayor by saying the engineers were undertaking geological work underneath the city because the Allies worried the Russians would ruin the sewage system. Construction of the tunnel was massive. Near the terminus of an East German and Russian-used route, the tunnel reached a cable 27 inches down after 1,476 feet of sandy soil. American tunnel diggers arrived on August 28, 1954, but water stalled them the next month. Clearing the mess required high-powered pumps. Tunnel building took another month after tunnel drilling concluded on February 28, 1955. The tunnel ran 500 yards below to the Soviet border and 500 yards to the main Soviet switching cable facility when completion. The tunnel has interconnecting parts. The subterranean post monitors lived in 3 prefabricated rooms with air conditioning. Each room was separated from the passageway by a metal door. The first taps appeared in May 1955. In August, tapping Soviet lines proved complicated. Underground agents began work. At peak tunnel operation, American listeners could watch over 500 connections, 121 voice circuits, and 4,000 feet of teletype. Operation Gold finished with the CIA having eavesdropped on 50,000 reels of tape, observed 443,000 completely transcribed Soviet East German discussions, compiled 40,000 hours of telephone calls, and collected 1,750 intelligence reports. The tunnel procedure, known as Harvey's Hole, provided the West with valuable information. The CIA captured all major political and military conversations, from East Germany to all Soviet outposts in Europe. The tunnel almost collapsed due to weather conditions, despite its advanced technology. In April 1956, heavy rain flooded Berlin's tunnel and exposed the cables. On April 21, Soviet maintenance crews found one room in the tunnel. The subterranean CIA officers fled. Harvey allegedly mocked the Russians. "You are now entering the American sector." Before leaving Berlin in early 1955, British double spy George Blake informed the Soviets about Allied tunnel plans, according to the CIA's Tunnel Affair Inquiry. The Soviets had to terminate a dangerous operation or lose a crucial penetration agent. They protected their source and let the tunnel run from May 1955 until April 1956, when the Soviet maintenance staff accidentally unearthed it. Blake was captured and condemned to 42 years in jail, but he escaped the reinforced Wormwood Scrubs prison in England in 1966 and became a hero in Moscow. The U.S. rejoiced when the Berlin Tunnel operation was disclosed. Press flocked to the story, with the New York Times labeling it a venture of extraordinary audacity, the stuff of which thriller films are made. The New York Herald Tribune called it a striking example of the CIA's daring endeavors. Seldom has an intelligence group performed a more competent and challenging job than the tunnel diggers. The Berlin Tunnel operation was the CIA's first significant Cold War covert action initiative, followed by others. William Harvey received the Distinguished Intelligence Medal from CIA Director Allen Dulles in a private ceremony for his role in the operation. Even well-deserved honors should be kept secret. A U.S. Army scientist investigating biological warfare, Frank Olson, died from the Manhattan Statler Hotel's 10th story on November 28, 1953. He jumped or was pushed. A CIA operator surreptitiously dosed Olson, who spoke about quitting his position and informed his wife he had made a terrible mistake 9 days before his death. 20 years later, President Gerald Ford apologized to Olson's family in person. Olson's sons think he was killed to keep him from revealing secrets, not a mental breakdown caused by the secret LSD dose. The murder of Frank Olson remains unsolved, despite Errol Morris's Netflix series. Olson had met Sidney Gottlieb, leader of MK-Ultra, who would poison him. Stephen Kinzer's Poisoner-in-Chief, Sidney Gottlieb and the CIA Search for Mind Control, recounts the amazing tale of a wonderful patriot and explorer who destroyed Americans and foreigners. Gottlieb was born in 1918 to Hungarian Jewish immigrants. Gottlieb, a scientist, was hired for covert U.S. chemical warfare research. During World War II, the U.S. began investigating germs and chemicals for military application, according to Kinzer. Gottlieb wanted to help with this study, Kinzer says. His club foot prevented him from joining the military effort. Kinzer said Gottlieb felt thankful to the nation that gave his parents a secure home and allowed him to study. Countries other than the U.S. researched new combat methods. Nazi chemical weapons researchers notoriously experimented on captives. The Nuremberg standards should have convicted such scientists for crimes against humanity after 1945, but an unknown number gained knowledge and a new life in the U.S. Kinzer notes that U.S. authorities routinely removed references to membership in the SS, collaboration with the Gestapo, abuse of slave laborers, and experiments on human subjects from the biographies of scientists with blemished pasts. Operation Paperclip was called after the paperclips used to mark the files of over 700 scientists transferred to the U.S. U.S. information came from more than Nazi war criminals. Secret trades also benefited Imperial Japanese Army Unit 731 chemical and biological weapons researchers. Unit 731's history is much murkier than Nazis. What we know is nightmares. Unit 731 studied illness effects on people via vivisection and organ removal, without anesthesia, on convicts. Kinzer tells how Cold War U.S. authorities believed such research may prove decisive in a future war. The U.S. Biological and Chemical Research Initiative expanded after the war. U.S. policymakers believed the Soviets were ahead in creating new warfare. Experiments on U.S. people were justified. In 1950, scientists unleashed innocuous but traceable germs into a U.S. metropolis in a big test. The continuous fog in San Francisco would hide germ clouds, so they picked it. Operation Sea Spray included a Navy ship spraying microorganisms into the air near San Francisco's shoreline for 6 days. In the days that followed, 11 individuals were hospitalized and 1 died. Although it wasn't as innocuous as expected, the researchers considered the experiment a success. It satisfied them that effective dosages can be produced over relatively large areas. Gottlieb had a different passion. He was more interested in mind-controlling substances than poisoning huge masses. Gottlieb's studies focused on LSD in subsequent years. Originally produced in 1938, scientists discovered its psychedelic qualities in the 1940s. Gottlieb believed LSD might influence people, make caught spies confess, and even change their personalities. Not only Gottlieb thought this. U.S. troops defecting to North Korea and reporting U.S. war crimes stunned U.S. establishment circles during the Korean War. U.S. intelligence believed only communists had mastered brainwashing. The 1962 film The Manchurian Candidate popularized this theory with its communist plan and indoctrinated U.S. soldier. U.S. intelligence officials broke the law out of fear of communist indoctrination, as they did of Soviet breakthroughs in bacteriological and chemical warfare. Korean prisoners of war and alleged communist agents supplied few human test pigs for the CIA. Gottlieb used his resources to discover victims. Gottlieb met Harris Isbell, head of research at the Lexington Addiction Research Center, shortly after initiating MK-Ultra. This drug addiction hospital, run by the Bureau of Prisons and the Public Health Service, functioned more like a prison. Most detainees were weak, downtrodden African Americans. Not content with Kentucky research, MK-Ultra expanded. The mid-1950s CIA noted Ewan Cameron's activities as president of the American Psychological Association and Canadian Psychiatric Association. Cameron's studies with patients in confined cells, drug-induced comas, and unending repetition of recorded utterances caught their interest. Cameron sought ways to repattern people's attitudes and ideas. Cameron unknowingly tested patients who sought his treatment. Cameron was CIA-funded and shielded, and a decades-later evaluation found his tests to have no therapeutic validity whatsoever and were comparable to Nazi medical atrocities. Misguided patriotism and Cold War anxieties do not explain Cameron's conduct. He was a sadist who traumatized individuals under a scientific veneer. CIA-funded prominent psychologists and psychiatric pharmacologists' research. Many didn't know their financial source. Research was done at MIT, Stanford, and Johns Hopkins. Many test volunteers were unaware of what they were about to undergo, violating research ethics. Some trials were harmless and appealing. Some tests gave student participants LSD. The participants' psychedelic experiences captivated physicians and nurses who tried it themselves. Ironically, the CIA popularized the 60s counterculture drug. The medicine that could manipulate minds was still a fantasy for Gottlieb. He undertook secret drug distribution operations in New York and San Francisco, observing residents' responses. Gottlieb and FBI agents established a San Francisco safe house in Operation Midnight Climax. According to Kinzer, Federal Bureau of Narcotics agent George Hunter White assembled a group of prostitutes whose job it would be to bring their clients to the pad and dose them with LSD while he watched and recorded their reactions. White used the covered operation to gratify his desires. Near death in 1975, MKUltra failed Gottlieb's expectations. The CIA started winding down the experiment in the late 60s and ended it a few years later. It became known because of a short time of democratic scrutiny of CIA activities in the mid-1970s. The New York Times uncovered unlawful domestic CIA actions in 1974. The legendary Frank Church panel was one of numerous U.S. Congress commissions investigating similar charges. Kinzer outlines the conflict between authorities who wanted to use such investigations as an alibi and others who wanted serious inquiries into unlawful activities. Gottlieb withdrew from the CIA in the early 1970s. After being named MKUltra's leader a few years later and called before a Senate commission, he negotiated a bargain to avoid punishment. Gottlieb quietly raised goats in his rural Virginia home for the remainder of his life. He died 1999. Poisoner-in-chief, individuals rather than societal forces dominate. The consequence is a history of weird criminals like Gottlieb and George Hunter White and their deeds. Some of the novel is bizarre. In one experiment, mentally handicapped children were fed cereal laced with uranium and radioactive calcium. CIA operatives supposedly implanted a listening device in a cat, but forgot that cats don't listen to instruction. It walked away during a park test. What enabled Gottlieb and others? Kinzer only partially explains Gottlieb's reasoning. The book reveals that years of expensive testing never suggested Manchurian candidate-style brainwashing. Instead of conceding they were pursuing a white rabbit, CIA scientists continued. Given his alleged success, Gottlieb's untouchability seems especially bizarre. Kinzer uses Gottlieb's prestige initiatives to illustrate his CIA influence. Gottlieb's success stories were mostly failures, such as his unsuccessful efforts to kill Zhou Enlai, Fidel Castro, and Patrice Lumumba. Lumumba was slain before Gottlieb's plot could be implemented. Gottlieb's career of harming people shows how hidden programs may take off without democratic control. Kinzer credits CIA Director William Colby, 1973-76, for partially exposing this craziness. However, the anti-war movement, Watergate, and the Pentagon Papers impacted Colby's actions. Public skepticism of the CIA and calls for accountability were pervasive. Accountability was again reduced in the late 1970s when these movements declined. During the War on Terror, the CIA and other intelligence organizations had unparalleled latitude. In Trump's presidency, there have been efforts to rebrand the CIA as a logical, intelligent, and beneficent U.S. state agency. Kinzer's book on Gottlieb and MKUltra shows how corrupt imperial spy masters were. In April, scientists and engineers flew a plane over northern Greenland to test a radar device. NASA Jet Propulsion Laboratory scientist Chad Green photographed the white expanse below them, 150 miles east of Patuxent Space Base. Radar also found an abandoned Cold War outpost beneath the ice, which was startling. "We were looking for the bed of the ice, and out pops Camp Century. NASA Jet Propulsion Laboratory scientist Alex Gardner, who led the experiment, said, not knowing what it was at first. Known as the City Under the Ice, Camp Century was a 1959 U.S. Army Corps of Engineers military post in Greenland. It was near the surface, but decades of snow and ice have buried it at least 100 feet underground. According to Andrew Paul of Popular Science, Camp Century marketed Arctic research back then. Its scientists collected the first ice core samples, which are still used in study, but it also housed Project Iceworm, a top-secret Cold War expedition. The clandestine operation sought to shelter and launch missiles in ice tunnels. Space.com quote Brett Tingley says the Iceman nuclear missiles might launch through the ice sheet. They might target the USSR. According to a February 1960 Popular Science article, Army engineers and the Danish government successfully built a community 800 miles from the North Pole, proving that the Arctic can be tamed. Popular Science reports that 100 scientists, engineers, and soldiers will move in late this year to a cozy, pleasant, and warm residence. The U.S. Army didn't immediately inform Denmark of Project Iceworm's genuine origins. Camp Century's construction in a remote area where temperatures may plummet below 70 degrees Fahrenheit and wind gusts can exceed 120 miles per hour is amazing. According to Newsweek's Jess Thompson, the facility was one of the first to employ a portable nuclear reactor, which was evacuated in 1967 when the camp and Project Iceworm were abandoned due to the impracticality of sustaining the construction amid the continually changing ice sheet. The University of Colorado Boulder's Cooperative Institute for Research in Environmental Sciences estimated that 53,000 gallons of diesel fuel, 63,000 gallons of wastewater, including sewage, and unknown amounts of reactor low-level radioactive coolant were left behind. The location may contain polychlorinated biphenyls, according to a 2016 research. Scientists worry that Earth's increasing temperatures may melt Camp Century's ice and reveal the garbage. When we looked at the climate simulations, they suggested that rather than perpetual snowfall, it seems that as early as 2090, the site could transition from net snowfall to net melt. York University climate and glacier scientist William Colgan, co-author of the 2016 study, said, once the site transitions from net snowfall to net melt, the wastes melt out irreversibly. Airborne surveys have discovered Camp Century, but the statement says the radars created two-dimensional maps with little resolution. NASA's UAVSAR, Uninhabited Aerial Vehicle Synthetic Aperture Radar, situated on the plane's belly, gave a map with more dimensionality than earlier data when the crew detected it in April. The findings appear to match historical record of the location. The Stalin Note was an official document sent by the Soviet Union to the three Western occupying powers, the US, UK, and France, proposing a four-power summit to establish a neutral, unified, and independent Germany, armed with its own military and a peace treaty. Its issuance on March 10, 1952, occurred at a critical juncture, immediately before West Germany's signature on the German General Treaty and the European Defense Community (EDC) Treaty, signifying its assimilation into Western frameworks and near sovereignty. A series of correspondence ensued throughout the summer of 1952 in response to the idea. However, no meeting took place, and the German division persisted until the years 1989-1990. This article investigates the possibility that this was a Soviet publicity ploy or a real opportunity for reunification that the West and West German Chancellor, Konrad Adenauer, wasted. Ohio University doctorate candidate Ruud van Dijk argues that the Stalin Note was a purposeful move inside the Cold War context, rather than a squandered opportunity, by using both pre-1989 Western sources and post-Cold War East Bloc archives. He argues that the argument is more reflective of contemporary German conflicts for identity than of actual historical events. Unconditional acceptance of the Oder-Neisse line as the eastern border, neutrality, and exclusion from Western alliances like NATO or the EDC were all parts of the Stalin Notes proposal for a united Germany. It seems that Stalin intended to thwart this process, given that he spoke only weeks before West Germany's EDC unification. After it, there was no more diplomatic dialogue, and historians, particularly those in West Germany, are still debating its relevance. The work of Rolf Steininger, whose 1985 article Eine Chance zur Wiedervereinigung, A Chance for Reunification, rekindled debate by using newly accessible American and British papers, is a pivotal figure in this topic. According to Steininger, Stalin made a genuine offer, and Adenauer, who was keen on Western integration, obstructed a possible way to reunite by refusing to negotiate. He framed the topic as, "Who is responsible for the continuing split of the country?" and blamed Adenauer for Germany's enduring separation. This approach combines historical research with political advocacy, as pointed out by Van Dyck, and it was attractive to a West German audience that was struggling with questions of national identity in the latter years of the Cold War. Among the critics who find Steininger's perspective lacking in persuasiveness is Van Dyck. They contend that he loses his impartiality due to his participation position, which in 1952 included promoting reunification as a feasible and desirable goal. New evidence from Soviet and East German archives post-1989 changes the story drastically, although the controversy heated up in the 1980s due to Western archival releases and the Historikerstreit, historians' disagreement, in Germany about its history. The controversy about Stalin's motivations persisted before to 1989 due to the lack of comprehensive Soviet evidence. The note's timing and the East German military buildup were two pieces of circumstantial evidence that pointed to a response to Western movements rather than a genuine unity offer. Historians like as Hermann Grommel have argued that the goal was not German unity, but rather the consolidation of Soviet power over the GDR via a propaganda campaign. There was no evidence to back up Adam Ulam's alternative, which proposed that Stalin may have seen the GDR as disposable in order to prevent a remilitarized West Germany supported by the United States. Clarity is provided by records that date after 1989, such as the notes taken by Wilhelm Pieck during talks in the Kremlin in 1952 and the Soviet Foreign Ministry files examined by Gerhard Wettig. According to Pieck's notes between April 1 and 7, 1952, Stalin quickly discarded the letter after its rejection by the West, and instead ordered a covert military buildup in the GDR. According to what Wettig found, the concept for the memo came from Ensur Gribanov in 1951 and was later polished by Andrei Gromyko so that it would appeal to West German opinion without really requesting substantive negotiations with the West. Not aiming for unity, Gromyko prioritized evasive language to thwart pledges, with the goal of disrupting West German remilitarization and EDC integration. These records prove that the memo was a Cold War ploy and not a serious proposal. The Soviets had no intention of giving up control of the GDR. Adenauer opposed discussions between the Western powers, according to Steininger's second pillar. Van Dyck analyzes two crucial points. United States Secretary of State Dean Acheson proposed limited negotiations in late April, early May 1952, following the initial letter, and in March 1952. Adenauer and other Western leaders turned down a summit in March because they were worried it would postpone the signing of the EDC and the General Treaty. The United States and Britain had an early tactical interest in revealing the Soviet Union's dishonesty, but they eventually agreed with Adenauer that the risks were too great to justify the potential rewards. In an effort to assuage West German concerns and reveal Soviet deception before to EDC ratification, Acheson suggested in April that negotiations be held at the level of the High Commissioner to address the topic of free elections. After giving his initial consent, Adenauer changed his mind on May 3 out of concern that it might delay treaty ratification. According to Steininger, this was a historical decision, since the West was coerced into submission by Adenauer's veto. Nevertheless, according to Van Dyck, who cites Grammel and Hermann Josef Rupieper, The resistance from the British and the French existed before Adenauer's change, and Acheson's suggestion was more of a tactical move than an invitation to engage in substantive discussions. Because the West saw Stalin's offer as a potential disruption, integration rather than unity was their first priority. The message was aimed at the West German public, promoting solidarity while using unpleasant language, such as the Oder-Neisse border and neutrality. People were wary of Western and Soviet intentions in 1952, but they were much more wary of Moscow. The Soviet Union's aspirations of influencing Germans to change Western policy were dashed when Adenauer's drive for unification with the West maintained majority support. According to Van Dyck, there was no chance lost with the Stalin note. The Soviet archives show that this was not a unification plan, but rather a propaganda tactic as part of a larger Cold War campaign to oppose Western integration. Free elections and alliance freedom, which were important for the West and Germany, were incompatible with the Soviet objective of retaining control of the GDR. These inconsistencies rendered any attempt at negotiation fruitless. Instead of historical evidence, Van Dyck contends that the ongoing discussion in West Germany is driven by identity concerns, shown by Arnulf Baring's 1982 comment that it would continue to be important until the Germans settle their sovereignty. The lost opportunity concept is debunked by fresh research, yet this is reflected in Steininger's advocacy. As an alternative to rehashing a non-existent opportunity, the article proposes that future studies examine the changes in how Germans saw the partition after 1952. On March 10, 1970, housewife and ex-Red Army Tank Regiment member Nina Kulagina used her thoughts alone to halt the heartbeat of a frog. At the Ukhtomsky Military Institute in Leningrad, Russia, Kulagina sat in an observation room, claiming to possess psychic abilities. Scientists were monitoring the amphibian's heart rate using electrodes connected to its little ticker, while they placed the recently extracted frog's heart in a solution that might sustain its beating for up to an hour. The Soviet medics who were keeping tabs on Kulagina said that while the 7 minutes it took her to mentally halt the frog's heart, her own heart rate rose considerably. She had spent 20 minutes getting ready for the workout. The next thing she did was attempt to increase the heart rate of a human doctor who was there, but doubtful of her abilities. Electronic heart rhythm monitors were attached to both. Analysts detected the doctor's heart rate as dangerous after a few minutes, and the trial was immediately stopped. The United States Department of Defense, however, was the first to have footage of it. Were Kulagina's psychic abilities real? Alternately, were the Soviets trying to hide their extrasensory weaponry from their enemies? Even though Americans had mixed feelings about the Soviet psychic and the dead frog, they could all agree that it had piqued their interest. We can now laugh at certain parts of the Cold War with a dark sense of humor, such the dog cosmonauts of the space race and the idea that duck and cover would protect people from nuclear fallout. The day's sincerity is part of the humor. The United States and the Soviet Union invested vast resources into developing more complex forms of espionage as the weapons race progressed, and the climate of intense distrust became more pervasive. There was psychic ability among them. Due to the utmost dedication of both sides to gathering information from each other, espionage programs developed a knack for remaining undetected. To remain undetected, they obtained secrets via the use of double agents, wiretaps, and other conventional tactics. But each of these approaches carried some degree of danger. Knowing the enemy's thoughts as well as his plans, and having the ability to influence his thoughts or destroy remotely without costly armament would be much better. The potential for psychic warfare seemed limitless, despite the fact that excitement around these skills remained moderate. For the Soviets, mysticism was just another kind of religion, an opiate of the masses, to use Marxist terminology. So this was a surprising turn of events. According to Annie Jacobson's book, Phenomena, The Secret History of the U.S. Government's Investigations into Extrasensory Perception and Psychokinesis, the Soviets had banned all paranormal activities. However, They reversed their stance when they realized they could secretly use mysticism as a spy tool. The first step, however, was to reframe their actions in terms more often used in science. A 1963 decree severed all ties to ESP's occult past by rewriting Soviet terminology surrounding ESP to sound technical, according to Jacobson. She continues by mentioning a few of the significant modifications to terminology that this brought about. Transcendental communication evolved into long-distance transmissions of biological systems. As a result, non-ionizing, in particular electromagnetic emissions from humans, replaced psychokinesis, the mental manipulation of physical things. The Soviet Union invested heavily in energy research in the 1960s, with the goal of better understanding the energetic fluxes around humans. They hoped to influence physical processes by using that energy. Discovery of the energy underlying ESP will be equivalent to the discovery of atomic energy, said the doctor in head of the Special Laboratory for Biocommunications Phenomena at the University of Leningrad. American military engineers found unusual electromagnetic signals coming from an apartment on the 10th floor of a building across the street from the U.S. Embassy in Moscow in 1962, while conducting a regular security check of the building. Based on their findings, the signal had been in operation for more than 6 years and was directed at the higher levels of the embassy building. The Pentagon's own program began at that point, initiating a clandestine effort to duplicate the effects of the Moscow signal was supposedly given to the Advanced Research Projects Agency by them, according to Jacobson. Studies along these lines were thus also being placed in the United States. 8 years down the road, the United States launched a joint intelligence assessment to investigate the Soviet psychoenergetic threat in light of the Kulagina tapes, just one instance of her psychic abilities, along with other footage showing her mentally manipulating matchsticks on a table. The report that came out of the 2-year investigation concluded that the Soviets were engaged in the development of methods of controlling or manipulating human behavior through subtle, non-identifiable means, and had a tremendous interest in parapsychology, the American word for the study of extrasensory perception. The CIA's Stargate program, which trained participants to use remote viewing talents, was launched in 1978. Using one's psychic abilities to see distant locations was required. For instance, a Soviet military base's longitudinal and latitudinal coordinates were sent to psychics and asked to depict what they saw, with surprisingly precise outcomes on occasion. The Central Intelligence Agency, CIA, also used the phrase anomalous cognition to characterize its peculiar methods of data collection, following in the footsteps of the Soviet Union, which built an entire technical vocabulary around its studies of extrasensory perception. The Men Who Stare at Goats, a book written by John Ronson in 2004 and made into a film in 2009, details some of the strange things that Stargate did. Despite the fact that psychic shows naysayers were always there, they continued airing far into the 1990s and maybe beyond. Former CIA Director Stansfield Turner told critics their skepticism about the CIA's psychic projects was healthy, but that research should keep pace with their skepticism, the article read in 1984's Washington Post, which added that the CIA nonetheless maintained a focus on psychic research. Skeptics and magicians alike thought Kulagina had rigged her purported clairvoyant performances. Pravda, a Russian publication, exposed her as a phony. In 1987, she prevailed partially in a slander lawsuit. However, the Soviet and even post-Soviet efforts to gain a psychological edge persisted long after her exposure. Russian forces reportedly used teams of military psychics throughout the Chechen conflicts, according to program officials. These cleared ranchlands have hosted some of the most renowned news footage. Shoot trespassers. The most expensive California oceanfront property is not for sale. Instead, concrete motion detectors and razor wire-topped 10-foot barriers hide it. Vandenberg Air Force Base in North Santa Barbara County makes history behind closed doors. Vandenberg is the U.S. ICBM test site. It hosts the controversial National Missile Military System and launches top-secret military satellites. Media critics called the 1980s SDI Star Wars. After Reagan left office, SDI seemed to expire, but President Bush revived it with the National Missile Defense System. The arrangement allows the U.S. flexibility in dealing with minor nuclear nations. No longer would the U.S. need its nuclear deterrence or mad rhetoric. The technology would allow the U.S. to retaliate to a missile launch by a lesser nuclear state without glowing the offending countries. 4 NMD tests were done. 2 out of 4 have succeeded, if you accept the unrealistic conditions of the tests, such as placing beacons on the warhead, said UCSB Nuclear Issues History of Science professor Lawrence Badash. The project's detractors include notable scientists from Berkeley, MIT, Cornell, UCLA, University of Maryland, University of Pennsylvania, and all U.S. nuclear facilities, as well as former Lockheed, Rumsfeld Commission, and Defense Science Board workers. Others doubt rockets threaten. The U.S. CIA official testifies to Congress that non-missile delivery methods are more likely to attack U.S. territory in the future due to their lower cost and greater reliability and accuracy. The government plans to spend $200 billion on NMD, mostly on Vandenberg. Some call the initiative a strategic vision, others a costly disaster. Such disagreement isn't new. Vandenberg started as Camp Cook, a WW-2 tank training camp, in 1941. Times change fast. As the Cold War peaked with ICBMs, the U.S. focused on missiles and satellites. The government quickly discovered it could store tanks almost anywhere, but test missiles only in a few areas. Vandenberg excelled at this. Its remote location on the West Coast enabled missiles and surveillance satellites to be launched into polar orbit, overlooking the Soviet Union's most important areas. Thus, North Santa Barbara County became California's Space Coast. Camp Cook gave the Air Force 64,047 of its 86,000 acres in June 1957 to create Cook Air Force Base. The installation became Vandenberg Air Force Installation in 1958. By 1960, the Air Force had purchased many South Pacific islands for target practice. The U.S. government began Vandenberg manned spy flights in 1966. Project name: Manned Orbiting Laboratories. MOL, codenamed Dorian, was a surveillance space station with a capsule. Air Force astronauts would conduct experiments and collect surveillance photos aboard the space station for a long time. After the mission, the astronauts would enter the capsule, disconnect from the station, and return to Earth. Space launch. Complex 6 on Vandenberg houses MOL's launch facility. Engineers loved calling it Slick 6. It would become a notorious aeronautical name. The Air Force spent billions building the massive base in North County over 3 years, employing hundreds. Other technological advancements emerged alongside Slick 6. At a fraction of the expense, spy satellites may meet or surpass all MOL mission goals. When the Department of Defense canceled Project Dorian on June 10, 1969, the MOL facility was virtually finished. Abandoned Slick 6 facility. The engineers went, workers went, money left. Santa Maria, Lompoc, and Guadalupe's once booming economy collapsed. North County almost had space-age ghost villages. Slick 6's rusted facilities were abandoned for 10 years. The aerospace industry came up with a revolutionary space travel concept in 1972. The space shuttle was so innovative that it is still in service 30 years later, with no plans to replace it. In 1972, the U.S. chose to establish 2 space shuttle launch sites. These included Cape Kennedy in Florida. The second launch site would be operated by the Air Force for top-secret military payloads. Construction would occur at Vandenberg. The Air Force told Congress in 1975 that constructing the shuttle launch complex at a huge launch site would save $100 million. Slick 6 building resumed in 1979. Building work revealed problematic or unsustainable components of the structure. The design failed so badly that several engineers anticipated the launch complex would explode on liftoff. Poor planning and construction plagued the facility. 8,000 slick welds were defective. Facility pipes were damaged or cut. Critical valves were broken or blocked. Lack of people and severe Air Force work hours caused poor construction. They worked us into the ground, recalled project engineer Marty Waldman. There was a scarcity of workers for the required tasks. Due to staffing shortages, several of us worked double shifts with no end in sight. We never knew when to sleep, wash, or anything else. Every night, weekend, and holiday was the same. Construction workers reported sleeping in their automobiles and working 16 and 18-hour days. Crime and divorce rose. The FBI and Air Force investigated worker drug and alcohol misuse after receiving multiple reports. NASA estimates a 1 in 100 shuttle flight mortality from Cape Kennedy. Similar calculations for Vandenberg predicted a 1 in 5 shuttle launch explosion. One worker told Congress, "There will be only one shuttle launch from Vandenberg because the whole launch pad will collapse when it's launched." The Vandenberg Public Affairs Office proclaimed Slick 6's completion early in 1985, despite launch facility issues and poor workmanship. Reagan made a similar declaration to the public in October. Challenger detonated over Florida months before Vandenberg's first shuttle flight. As the country reeled, the Air Force secretly buried the shuttle program and disguised a $1 billion repair cost. Each categorization of Slick 6, operational, minimum, and mothballed, made it take longer to return the facility to operating order. Vandenberg shuttle project ended in 1989. The entire cost was $3 billion. After another unsuccessful Air Force effort, Slick 6 was leased to Lockheed Aerospace, which had 3 failure launches before its first successful flight. All these instances have created a basic legend. The Chumash burial place was found in 1966 when clearing the Slick for the MOL. Native American tribal members urged that the holy place be examined and recorded, and their bones reburied somewhere. Roger Guillemet, a Vandenberg historian, said the Air Force, insistent about its timetable, seemed to let workers complete building without hindrance. The Chumash were upset, and local folklore says a tribal chief cursed the location, causing 30 years of failed efforts. Lockheed launched the first successful launch from Slick 6 on September 24, 1999, 2 years ago Monday. Slick 6's curse seems lifted. Lockheed allegedly bribed a Chumash priest to remove it.